You're standing in a frozen driveway at 6 in the morning, minus 28, and you're staring at two trucks. One's a Toyota, one's a Honda, and you're about to spend $30,000 on whichever one you trust to still start when you're 75 years old. Here's what nobody at the dealership will tell you. In Canada, one of these engines is quietly less reliable than the other, and it has almost nothing to do with the engine being badly built. It has to do with our cold. And it's not the brand most people bet on. I spent the better part of 2 winters chasing this down because I got burned once and I swore I never would again. I read the service bulletins. I read the complaints. I talked to mechanics who've had their hands inside both of these engines for 30 years. And it all comes back to one document filed in 2018 that most Canadians have never seen, plus one forgotten habit from the 1940s that can save the exact engine that's failing. Stay with me, because whichever truck sits in your driveway right now, the fix I found at the end works on the vehicle you already own. You don't need to buy anything new. Let me start where I started. With the myth, because if you ask 10 Canadians which engine lasts longer, Toyota or Honda, most of them will shrug and say it doesn't matter, they're both bulletproof, they both run forever, buy whichever one's cheaper. And for about 40 years that answer was basically correct. I believed it myself. My father-in-law drove a Honda Accord for 19 years and put over 400,000 kilometers on it before the body rusted out from underneath a perfectly good motor. My neighbor ran a Toyota pickup so long the odometer rolled past 350,000 and he sold it to his own son. So when I say one of them is less reliable up here, I'm not talking about junk. I'm talking about 2 of the finest engines ever mass-produced, and a difference that only shows up when the temperature drops below what most of the world ever sees. That's the thing that got me. The reliability charts you read online, the big American consumer surveys, the glossy magazine rankings, most of them are built on data from California, Texas, Arizona, warm places that never see a real Canadian February. And an engine that behaves like a saint at plus 15 can behave like something else entirely at minus 30. So I stopped reading the warm weather charts, and I went looking for the cold weather truth. But here's where the trail got strange. Because the more I dug, the more I realized the problem wasn't old engines wearing out. It was new engines, the ones built in the last 10 years, behaving in a way the old ones never did. Let me tell you about the first real clue I found. It was a complaint. Actually, it was hundreds of complaints, and they all said nearly the same thing. Owners of newer Hondas, the Civic, the CR-V, the Accord with the small turbocharged engine, were pulling out their dipsticks in winter and finding something that made no sense. The oil level was going up, not down, up. Now, if you've ever owned a car, you know oil is supposed to slowly disappear. It burns off a little, it drips a little, and every few thousand kilometers you top it up. That's normal. That's 100 years of how engines work. But these owners were seeing the opposite. The oil on the stick was climbing past the full line. And when they leaned in and smelled it, it smelled like gasoline. That's the clue. That's the whole mystery in one sentence. The gasoline was leaking down past the pistons and mixing into the oil. Mechanics call it fuel dilution. And when your oil turns into a thin, gassy soup, it stops protecting the metal parts it's supposed to protect. The oil gets watered down, it loses its thickness, and the bearings and the cylinder walls start grinding against each other with far less protection than the engineers ever intended. Here's the part that made me sit up. It was happening worst in the cold. The colder the climate, the shorter the trips, the more the fuel piled up in the oil, which meant the place on Earth where this problem would hit hardest was exactly the place I was standing, Canada. Northern Ontario, the prairies, anywhere the winter actually bites. I found owners in Winnipeg and Saskatoon and Thunder Bay describing the exact same thing. And I found owners in Florida who had no idea what anyone was complaining about, because down there it barely happened at all. So now I had my first answer forming. The Honda, the small modern turbo Honda, had a cold weather weakness the warm weather charts couldn't see. But that raised a bigger question, didn't it? Because Honda didn't build bad engines for 40 years and then suddenly forget how. Something changed, somebody decided to build the engine differently. And I wanted to know who, and I wanted to know why. That's when the investigation stopped being about oil and started being about a decision made in a boardroom. Let me explain what actually changed under the hood, because once you understand this, you'll never look at a new car window sticker the same way again. For most of the time you and I have been alive, a family car had a fairly big engine. A 4-cylinder was around 2 liters, sometimes 2.5. A nice smooth 6 was 3 liters or more. Big engines, breathing easily, working without strain. That's part of why they lasted. An engine that isn't stressed is an engine that lives a long life. My grandfather used to say you never work a horse harder than it wants to go, and it turns out the same is true of a motor. Then, somewhere in the early 2010s, the industry made a turn. Around 2016, Honda rolled out a family of engines it marketed under the name Earth Dreams. Lovely name. What it actually meant was smaller. They took that 2-liter engine and shrank it down to 1.5 liters. Then, to get the power back, they bolted on a turbocharger and switched to something called direct injection, where the gasoline gets sprayed straight into the cylinder at very high pressure. On paper, it's brilliant. Smaller engine, less fuel, more miles per tank, and the turbo gives you the power when you stomp on it. In a laboratory, in mild weather, it's a genuine engineering achievement. But in the real Canadian cold, that high-pressure fuel spray doesn't fully burn when the engine's still cold. Some of it splashes onto the cold cylinder walls, slides past the rings, and drips down into the oil pan. On a short winter trip, say you drive 10 minutes to the grocery store and the engine never fully warms up, that fuel never gets a chance to boil back out. So it just accumulates trip after trip, cold morning after cold morning, all winter long. The old 2-liter engine, the one without the turbo and the high-pressure injection, barely did this at all. The new downsized turbo engine does it far more. So there's your villain, and it's not really Honda. It's the pressure that pushed Honda and Toyota and everyone else to shrink their engines in the first place. Governments across North America tightened the fuel economy rules, demanding higher and higher miles per gallon on the official test. And that official test? It's run in mild conditions. It doesn't have a Canadian January in it. So automakers built engines that ace a warm weather test and pass the cold weather reality on to you, the owner, without ever mentioning it. Nobody lied to you exactly. They just never told you that the engine optimized for a government fuel test in mild weather might behave differently in the coldest inhabited places on the continent. And you're the one who found out, one confused dipstick reading at a time. I don't want you walking away thinking Toyota never stumbles, because they do, and if I told you they were perfect, you'd be right to stop trusting me. Here's Toyota's dark chapter. Going back to the mid-2000s, a lot of Toyota 4-cylinder engines, the ones they put in the Camry, the RAV4, some Corollas, in that stretch roughly from 2007 to about 2011 developed a nasty habit of burning oil. Not leaking it, burning it. The piston rings, the little metal bands that seal the piston against the cylinder wall, were designed in a way that let them clog up and stop sealing. So the engine would quietly drink its own oil, sometimes a liter every 1,000 or 2,000 kilometers, and the owner wouldn't even know until a warning light came on or the engine seized. I read the stories. People who checked their oil faithfully were fine. People who trusted the old rule, change it every 5,000 and forget about it, some of them lost whole engines. And there was a related problem on certain of those motors where the bolts holding the cylinder head could strip out of the aluminum block, which is a very expensive day at the shop. And Toyota's smooth 6-cylinder, the V6, they shared across a lot of models. Some versions of that had their own troubles with oil lines that could gunk up and starve the engine. So let me be straight with you, neither company has clean hands. Both of them have built specific engines in specific years that failed in specific ways. Anyone who tells you Toyota never fails or Honda never fails is selling you something. But here's the difference that finally settled it in my mind, and it's the whole reason for the question we started with. Toyota's worst problem, the oil burning, was a manufacturing flaw in a particular batch of engines, and it was largely fixed by the middle of the last decade. It wasn't made worse by cold. A Toyota that burns oil burns it the same in Vancouver as in Miami. Honda's turbo problem is different. It's not a flaw in one bad batch. It's baked into how the modern downsized turbo engine works, and it gets dramatically worse the colder it gets and the shorter your trips are. Which means it's a problem aimed like an arrow straight at us. At Canadians. At the retired couple who drives 15 minutes to church and 15 minutes back. At the person in a cold northern town who never puts on enough highway kilometers in winter to boil the fuel back out of the oil. So if you ask me the exact question in the title, which one is less reliable in Canada, my honest answer, after 2 winters of digging, is that the modern small-turbo Honda 4-cylinder carries the bigger cold weather risk in this country than the equivalent Toyota. Not because Honda forgot how to build engines, but because the engine they built to pass a mild weather fuel test meets its worst enemy in a Canadian driveway. Now, before you run off and cancel your Honda order, or worse, feel sick because a Honda is already parked outside your window, hold on, because this next part is the whole reason I made this. And it's built specifically for you. That made me angry, honestly. And if you want to go deeper than one video can take you, I've put everything I found, the service bulletins, the cold start data, the full mechanics of fuel dilution, and the complete block heater revival method into a book called The Maple Reset. It covers not just this engine problem, but the whole pattern of Canadian-specific knowledge that got quietly set aside, and it's available in the description below. If you're the kind of person who wants the full picture in one place, it's built exactly for you. But I had to be fair. Because the moment I started thinking Toyota was the automatic winner, the trail turned again and I found Toyota's skeletons too. I know exactly what some of you are thinking right now. You're thinking, well, that's just wonderful. I already own the Honda. Or, I can't afford to go trade in a perfectly good vehicle over something I just heard about on the internet. Or, I don't have a heated garage and a mechanic on call and money to burn. This is fine for someone starting fresh, but it's not for me. It is for you. That's the point. Everything I'm about to tell you works on the vehicle sitting in your driveway right now, cold engine and all, without a single new part and without a professional. You don't need land. You don't need money. You don't need a fresh start. You need to understand what the fuel is doing in there, and you need one old habit that most people threw away. Here's the first thing, and it costs you nothing. Learn to read your own dipstick like the old-timers did. Once a week in winter, before you start the car in the morning, when the oil's had all night to settle, pull that stick out, wipe it, dip it, and look. You're looking for two things. Is the level climbing above full? And does it smell like gas when you hold it up to your nose? If the answer is yes, your oil is being diluted, and that's your signal to act. That simple 30-second check is something almost nobody does anymore, and it's the single earliest warning you'll ever get. My father did it every Sunday. I laughed at him for it once. I don't laugh now. Here's the second thing. Change your oil by the calendar, not just the kilometers, if you do a lot of short, cold trips. The modern advice of going 8 or 10 or even 16,000 kilometers between changes was written for highway driving in mild weather. If you're doing short winter hops around town, that gassy, watered-down oil needs to come out sooner. I tell people who drive short in the cold to change it more like every 5,000 kilometers or twice a winter, whichever comes first. A $40 or $60 oil change is the cheapest engine insurance ever invented. And here's the third thing, and it's so simple people don't believe it works. Take your vehicle out on the highway once a week and drive it hard enough and long enough to get properly hot, 20-30 minutes at highway speed. That heat is what boils the raw fuel back out of your oil and sends it out the tailpipe where it belongs. The engine can actually clean itself if you let it get hot enough, long enough. The people who have the worst trouble are the ones who only ever do 5 and 10-minute crawls and never let the thing truly warm up. One good long drive a week undoes a lot of short trip damage. None of that requires a dealership. None of it requires a new truck. It requires you to pay attention the way people used to pay attention back before we were told to just trust the machine and never look under the hood. But there's one more piece, the biggest piece. The thing that attacks this problem at its root, and it comes from a Canadian habit so old, most people have forgotten why we ever started doing it. And once I explain where it came from, you're going to want to walk out to your driveway tonight. Let me take you back to the winter of 1947. There was a man named Andrew Freeman working in the brutal cold of the northern plains, in a place where the winters are every bit as cruel as ours on the prairies. And he was sick of the same thing you're sick of. Engines that wouldn't start, oil that turned to molasses overnight, metal so cold it wouldn't do its job. So in 1947, he came up with something and got it patented. A simple electric heating element that you install right into the engine block, plug into a wall outlet overnight, and it keeps the engine warm while it sleeps. We know it in this country as the block heater. And there is no place on earth that adopted it more completely than Canada. Drive through any town in Manitoba or Saskatchewan or northern Alberta in January, and you'll see them, the little electrical cords poking out through the front grills of the trucks, the outlets standing on posts in the grocery store parking lot, the extension cords running out the kitchen window to the driveway. For generations of Canadians, plugging in the car at night was as automatic as locking the front door. And then, quietly, a lot of us stopped. Newer cars started so easily even in the cold that people decided the block heater was old-fashioned, unnecessary, a relic. Younger folks moved to the city and never learned to use the one their car came with. Whole driveways full of vehicles with a perfectly good block heater installed from the factory, never once plugged in. Here's what I found in the research, and here's why I'm telling you this story now, at the very end, instead of the beginning. That forgotten Canadian habit is the single best defense against the exact modern problem we've been chasing this whole time. Think about it. The fuel dilution happens because the engine starts up ice cold and stays cold, so the raw gasoline splashes on frigid cylinder walls and drips into the oil instead of burning. But what if the engine wasn't ice cold at startup? What if it was already warm, sitting there at a gentle temperature because it spent the night plugged in? When you plug in a block heater for 2 or 3 hours before you drive, you don't even need it on all night. A timer set to come on a couple hours before you leave does the job. The engine starts far warmer. The oil is thinner and flows instantly. The cylinder walls aren't freezing. The fuel burns the way it's supposed to burn instead of condensing and running down into your oil. The single biggest cause of the whole cold weather reliability gap gets cut down dramatically because you've removed the deep cold that causes it. The engineers who study cold starts have known for decades that the first few minutes of a frigid startup cause more wear than hours of normal driving, and that a preheated engine slashes that wear and cuts the raw fuel and pollution pouring out during warm-up. A warm start is a clean start. A clean start doesn't dump gasoline into your oil. It's the same physics, whether we're talking about a farm truck in 1947 or a brand new turbocharged Honda tonight. So here is the secret, the thing I promised you at the start, the thing hardly anyone puts together. The very tool that best protects the least reliable modern engine in Canada is a Canadian invention from 1947 that most people quit using right around the time these fragile new engines showed up. We threw away the cure at almost the exact moment we started buying the disease. And here's how you use it this weekend. Go out to your vehicle, look at the front of it, low down, near the grille, or peeking out past the bumper. A huge number of vehicles sold in Canada came with a block heater installed at the factory and a little capped electrical plug tucked up in there that the owner never even knew existed. If you find that plug, you already own the fix. Buy a heavy-duty outdoor extension cord and a cheap outlet timer, set the timer to switch on about 2 hours before you normally leave in the morning, and plug in every cold night. If you're not sure whether you have one, a mechanic can tell you in 30 seconds at your next oil change, and installing one after the fact is not an expensive job. 2 hours of cheap electricity a night. That's it. A warm engine, oil that flows, fuel that burns clean, and the single worst cold weather weakness of the modern engine mostly canceled out using a tool your grandparents considered as ordinary as a pair of winter boots. That's the whole trail. That's where 2 winters of digging led me. Not to some exotic gadget you have to order and wait for. Not to trading away a good vehicle in a panic. It led me right back to a plain gray cord hanging out of a grill in a prairie parking lot and a patent from the year my own parents were young. So let me leave you with the honest bottom line. The one I wish somebody had handed me before I ever stood in that frozen driveway trying to choose. Both Toyota and Honda build engines that can outlast the body they're bolted into. But in the specific, brutal reality of a Canadian winter, the modern downsized turbo Honda 4 carries a cold weather risk that the warm country reliability charts will never show you, because that risk was designed around a fuel test that has no January in it. And whichever badge is on your hood right now, the difference between an engine that dies young and one that runs for 20 years isn't luck, and it isn't the brand. It's whether you read your own oil, whether you let the engine get properly hot, and whether you use the one plain Canadian tool we were handed in 1947 and were quietly talked out of using. You didn't get unlucky with your vehicle. You just got sold the half of the story that fit the showroom. The other half, the half that keeps the engine alive up here, got left out on purpose because a warm engine that lasts 20 years doesn't sell as many new ones. If you're the kind of person who suspects that a lot of what we call progress is really just cost and risk quietly shifted onto your shoulders, then you already understand exactly what we did here today. We didn't find a trick. We found something that was taken from us, and we took it back. Now I want to hear from you, and I mean this plainly, because I know most of you watch and never say a word. 2 questions. First, walk out and look at the front of your vehicle and tell me in the comments whether you found a block heater plug you never knew was there. I genuinely want to know how many of you have been driving around with the cure hidden behind your own grill. And second, tell me where in this country you're watching from and how cold it gets where you are in the worst week of the year. I want to see this map of Canada fill up in the comments from the coast to the far north. And if you believe, like I've come to believe, that real practical knowledge keeps getting set aside not because it stopped working, but because somebody profits from us forgetting it, then come along with me. Subscribe and stand with the folks who are digging this stuff back up one video at a time, because next time I'm going after something even closer to home. There's an old way Canadians used to heat a single room for pennies through the coldest nights, long before we were all talked into heating the whole house at once, and the reason it disappeared is going to make you just as angry as this one did. I found the document. I'll see you there. If you stayed with me this far, there's more. Inside the Northern Ways circle, I pick up right where this video stopped and give you the full cold weather drivetrain map, engine by engine. You can ask me your own question, and I answer you myself, no robots, and you'd be joining thousands of practical folks like you already inside. Just point your phone's camera at the code on your screen. It takes a minute, and you can cancel any time with one click, no risk.